In a world where justice is supposed to reign, Natalie Brooks, a respected black attorney, finds herself handcuffed in a courthouse parking lot, accused of a crime she didn't commit. As the officer's prejudiced gaze strips away her identity, she realizes that the very system she has fought to uphold has turned against her. But what begins as a moment of humiliation will ignite a fierce battle for justice, revealing that the true enemy lies not in the courtroom, but within the hearts of those sworn to protect it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse parking lot as Natalie Brooks hurriedly rummaged through her SUV. After a grueling day in court securing a conviction in a high-profile case, all she wanted was to head home and unwind. But her purse, containing her car keys, seemed to have vanished into thin air. "It has to be here somewhere," she muttered, leaning further into the vehicle. Her tailored blazer stretched across her shoulders as she searched between the seats, her professional demeanor slightly disheveled after hours in court. The sound of approaching footsteps barely registered until a harsh voice cut through her concentration. "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am." Natalie straightened slowly, her heart skipping a beat as she found herself staring into the stern face of a white police officer. His hand rested cautiously on his holster, his stance rigid with suspicion. "Officer," she began calmly, smoothing her blazer. "This is my car. I'm just looking for my—" I said, "Step away from the vehicle." Officer Jackson interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of authority that bordered on hostility. His badge glinted in the fading sunlight, number 4721. Natalie took a measured breath, drawing upon years of courtroom experience to maintain her composure. "Officer Jackson, I'm Natalie Brooks, a state prosecutor. This is my vehicle, and I can prove it if you'll allow me to. Ma'am, if you don't step away immediately, I'll have to place you under arrest." Jackson cut in again, his tone dismissive. His eyes swept over her professional attire with undisguised skepticism, as if her suit and briefcase were merely props in an elaborate deception. The irony wasn't lost on Natalie. Just hours ago, she had stood in court, representing the very system that was now treating her like a criminal. She had won a case that morning, earning justice for a victim, only to find herself victim to the very prejudices she fought against daily. "Officer, please check my ID. It's in my briefcase right here," Natalie said, gesturing slowly toward the leather bag sitting on the passenger seat. Her voice remained steady, though her pulse raced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Instead of reaching for the briefcase, Officer Jackson stepped closer, his hand now firmly gripping his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "This is ridiculous," Natalie protested, her professional facade beginning to crack. "I'm a state prosecutor. You can call the courthouse right now and verify." Before she could finish, Jackson had grabbed her arm, spinning her around with unnecessary force. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists as he secured them, tight enough to make her wince. "You have the right to remain silent," Jackson began reciting mechanically, as if he'd already decided her guilt based on nothing more than the color of her skin. As he led her toward his patrol car, Natalie caught glimpses of other courthouse employees watching from a distance. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others pulled out their phones, likely recording the scene. The shame and humiliation burned hot on her cheeks, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she knew exactly why this was happening. Through the window of her SUV, she could see her purse, partially hidden under the passenger seat where it had slid during her morning commute. The irony was almost too much to bear. The very thing she had been searching for would now be evidence in what was sure to become a much bigger story. As Officer Jackson pushed her head down to guide her into the back of his patrol car, Natalie's mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every black person who had ever been presumed guilty without cause, every professional who had been doubted because of their skin color, every citizen who had faced the bitter sting of prejudice wrapped in a badge of authority. The door slammed shut, and Natalie watched through the window as Officer Jackson began to radio in his suspect. She sat up straight, her shoulders back, dignity intact despite the handcuffs. She knew this was just the beginning of a battle she never asked for, but one she was more than prepared to fight. In the growing darkness of the patrol car's back seat, Natalie Brooks, state prosecutor and respected attorney, found herself on the other side of justice, not because of any crime she had committed, but because of a judgment made in the split second it took for a prejudiced officer to see a black woman and assume the worst. The interior of the police car felt stifling, the air thick with a tension that made it hard for Natalie to breathe. She sat in the back seat, her wrists still bound by the cold metal of the handcuffs, a stark reminder of the injustice she was enduring. The world outside blurred as Officer Jackson climbed into the front seat, his demeanor unyielding, as if he were the judge and jury in a case that had yet to be presented. Natalie leaned her head against the cool glass, staring out at the parking lot where her colleagues had once walked with respect and admiration. Now she felt like a ghost, a specter of the woman she had been just hours before. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, and she couldn't help but reflect on the countless times she had faced prejudice throughout her career. Each instance had chipped away at her spirit, but this was different. This was a visceral reminder of the systemic racism that permeated society, even in the very institutions meant to uphold justice. As Officer Jackson spoke into the radio, relaying her arrest, Natalie's mind raced. She thought of her family, her friends, and the countless black individuals who had faced similar situations. How many had been silenced, their stories buried under the weight of prejudice? She felt a surge of anger rise within her, a fire igniting her resolve. She would not be another statistic. She would fight back. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the police station. The door swung open, and Jackson gestured for her to step out. "Get out," he ordered, his tone devoid of empathy. As she climbed out of the car, the handcuffs clinked against each other, a sound that echoed in her ears like a cruel reminder of her current reality. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the stark, sterile environment. Officers moved about, some casting curious glances her way, while others seemed indifferent to her plight. Jackson led her to a small holding area, where he unceremoniously shoved her into a chair. "Wait here," he said, his voice flat. He walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The silence was deafening, and Natalie felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She was a prosecutor, a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The anger simmered within her, but she knew she had to remain calm. She needed to think clearly to strategize her next move. Finally, Jackson returned, a smirk playing on his lips as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Still think you're above the law, huh?" he taunted, his eyes glinting with a mix of arrogance and disdain. "You're just another criminal to me." Natalie's heart raced, but she refused to let him see her fear. "You have no idea who I am," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm a state prosecutor. I've dedicated my life to upholding the law, and I will not let you treat me like this." Jackson chuckled, the sound mocking. "Yeah, right. You think that matters? You're just a black woman in a nice suit. You're not special." The words stung, but Natalie held her ground. "You're wrong. I am special, and I will prove it. You can't just arrest someone without cause because of the color of their skin." "Save it for the judge," he shot back, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "You'll be lucky if you get a phone call." But Natalie was not about to give up. She had faced adversity before, and she had always come out stronger. She needed to reach out to someone who could help her, someone who would understand the gravity of the situation. With a deep breath, she summoned her courage. "Can I make a phone call?" she asked, her voice firm. Jackson hesitated, his expression shifting slightly. "Fine. One call. Make it quick." He uncuffed her long enough for her to reach into her briefcase and retrieve her phone. As she dialed Ethan Lewis, her colleague and friend, she felt a flicker of hope. Ethan was not just an attorney. He was a fierce advocate for justice, someone who would stand by her side no matter the circumstances. "Ethan, it's Natalie," she said as soon as he picked up. "I need your help. I've been arrested." "What?" "Natalie, what happened?" His voice was filled with concern. "I was just looking for my purse in my car, and Officer Jackson thought I was trying to steal it. He arrested me without checking my ID," she explained, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. "Stay calm. I'm on my way," Ethan replied, his tone resolute. "I'll be there as soon as I can." As she hung up, a sense of determination washed over her. She would not let this moment define her. She would fight back against the injustice, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. When Ethan arrived, he strode into the station with an air of authority that immediately caught the attention of the officers. He approached the front desk, his expression serious. "I'm here to see Natalie Brooks. She's been wrongfully arrested." Jackson, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened up, his demeanor shifting slightly. "You can't just waltz in here and demand to see her," he said, trying to assert his authority. Ethan's gaze was unwavering. "I'm her colleague and a fellow attorney. You have no right to detain her without cause. I demand an explanation." The tension in the room thickened as Jackson's bravado faltered under Ethan's scrutiny. "She was acting suspiciously," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Acting suspiciously? She was looking for her purse in her own car." Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "You're treating her like a criminal because of the color of her skin. This is unacceptable." Under pressure from Ethan and the growing presence of other officers who had gathered to witness the confrontation, Jackson's facade began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his colleagues for support, but found none. "Fine," he muttered, begrudgingly. "I'll release her, but this isn't over." As he uncuffed Natalie, she felt a rush of relief mixed with anger. She had been wronged and the fight was far from over. But in that moment, she was grateful for Ethan's support, knowing that together they would seek justice for not just herself, but for all those who had faced similar injustices. "Let's get out of here," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. As they walked out of the station, Natalie felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience would not break her. It would fuel her fight for justice and equality. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Natalie took a deep breath, the weight of the handcuffs replaced by a determination to expose the truth. She would not let this moment fade into obscurity. She would make sure that Officer Jackson's actions were scrutinized, that the systemic racism she had faced would be brought to light. Together, they would turn this injustice into a rallying cry for change, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had just experienced. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Ethan Lewis stood toe-to-toe with Officer Jackson, his normally composed demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. The contrast between the two men was striking. Ethan in his tailored suit, every inch the accomplished attorney, and Jackson in his wrinkled uniform, his authority suddenly seeming less absolute. "Let me make this perfectly clear." Ethan's voice cut through the tension-filled air. "The woman you arrested is Natalie Brooks, Senior State Prosecutor for the District Attorney's Office. The same office, I might add, that works closely with your department on countless cases." Jackson's face flushed, but his stance remained defensive. "She was acting suspiciously." "Suspiciously?" Ethan's laugh was sharp and without humor. "By searching for her purse in her own vehicle? Or was it something else that made you suspicious, Officer Jackson?" The implied accusation hung heavy in the air. Several other officers had gathered around, drawn by the confrontation. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she pieced together the situation. "What's going on here?" Martinez stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. Ethan turned to her, his voice measured but firm. "Lieutenant, your officer here arrested a state prosecutor without cause, without checking her identification, and without allowing her to verify her ownership of the vehicle in question. I'd say what's going on here is a clear case of racial profiling and abuse of power." Martinez's eyes narrowed as she turned to Jackson. "Is this true, Officer Jackson?" "Ma'am, I was following protocol," Jackson began, but Martinez cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Protocol? Natalie spoke up, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Is it protocol to ignore someone's explanation? To refuse to check their ID? To mock them while they're detained? She stepped forward, her professional dignity intact despite the ordeal. Or is it only protocol when the person you're dealing with looks like me? The silence that followed was deafening. Several officers shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Natalie's gaze. Lieutenant Martinez's expression hardened as she processed the implications. Officer Jackson, my office. Now. Martinez's tone left no room for argument. Ms. Brooks, Mr. Lewis, I sincerely apologize for this incident. We will be conducting a full investigation. Jackson's face had turned an interesting shade of purple, but he remained defiant. This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job. Your job. Natalie's voice was quiet but carried across the room. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and discriminate, not to make assumptions based on the color of someone's skin, and certainly not to abuse your power when those assumptions are challenged. She stepped closer to Jackson, her presence commanding despite their height difference. You didn't see a state prosecutor today. You didn't see a professional woman looking for her purse. You saw what your prejudice wanted you to see. Just another black person to suspect, to demean, to put in their place. The truth of her words seemed to ripple through the room. Several officers looked away, perhaps recognizing similar biases in themselves. Others nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of the moment. This ends today, Natalie continued, her voice gaining strength. Not just for me, but for every person who has ever been profiled, every citizen who has been treated as less than human because of their race. You picked the wrong person to discriminate against, Officer Jackson, because I know the law, I know my rights, and I know exactly how to fight back. Lieutenant Martinez stepped forward again. Ms. Brooks, I assure you this matter will be handled with the utmost seriousness. Officer Jackson will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Jackson's protest died on his lips as Martinez fixed him with a stern glare. Officer, I suggest you remain silent. You've done enough damage for one day. As Jackson was led away to Martinez's office, the remaining officers began to disperse, the tension in the room slowly dissipating. Ethan placed a supportive hand on Natalie's shoulder. You okay? He asked quietly. Natalie took a deep breath, straightening her jacket. No, I'm not okay, but I will be. This isn't over, not by a long shot. As they walked out of the police station, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Natalie paused, looking back at the building where her dignity had been stripped away and then reclaimed. You know what the worst part is? She said to Ethan. This happens every day to people who don't have the resources or platform to fight back. People who don't have colleagues like you to come to their rescue. People who are simply trying to live their lives but are constantly viewed as suspects. Ethan nodded solemnly. So what's our next move? A determined smile crossed Natalie's face. We make sure this incident doesn't get buried in paperwork or dismissed as a misunderstanding. We use it to force real change. Jackson's suspension is just the beginning. As they walked to Ethan's car, Natalie's mind was already formulating a plan. This humiliating experience would become a catalyst for change, a way to expose the systemic racism that still plagued law enforcement. She would transform her pain into purpose, her anger into action. The confrontation at the police station wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been wrongly profiled, every voice that had been silenced by prejudice. And Natalie Brooks was just getting started. The story of Natalie Brooks's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire through social media and local news outlets. What started as a single incident in a courthouse parking lot had ignited a movement, bringing to light countless similar stories of racial profiling and discrimination within the police force. Sitting in her office at the district attorney's building, Natalie stared at her computer screen, overwhelmed by the flood of emails and messages. Each one told a similar story: Black professionals, students, parents, and workers who had been stopped, questioned, or arrested simply because of their skin color. You need to see this. Ethan said, walking into her office with a tablet in hand. He pulled up a video that had gone viral overnight, security camera footage from the courthouse parking lot showing her arrest. The images were clear. Her professional demeanor, Officer Jackson's aggressive approach, the unnecessary force used during her arrest. It's been viewed over 1 million times, Ethan explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. The comments section is filled with people sharing their own experiences. This isn't just about you anymore, Natalie. It's become something bigger. Natalie nodded, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on her desk. That's exactly what we need. The system only changes when enough people demand it. She reached for a folder on her desk, pulling out a carefully prepared document. I've already filed a formal complaint with the Internal Affairs Division, but we're going further. We're requesting a full investigation into the department's history of racial profiling incidents. A knock at her door interrupted them. It was Marcus Johnson, the district attorney himself, his expression grave. Natalie, do you have a moment? As she gestured for him to enter, Marcus closed the door behind him. I've just come from a meeting with the police commissioner. They're trying to handle this internally. Keep it quiet. They're offering to formally apologize and implement some basic sensitivity training. Natalie's laugh was bitter. Sensitivity training? That's their solution to systemic racism? They're scared, Marcus replied, taking a seat. Your case has exposed something they've been trying to hide for years. The number of people coming forward with similar stories. It's damning. Good, Natalie said firmly. They should be scared, because we're not stopping until there's real change. Just then, her phone buzzed with a notification. Another news outlet wanted to interview her. The story had caught the attention of national media, and requests were pouring in from across the country. The police officers' union is pushing back, Ethan warned, scrolling through his phone. They're trying to paint Jackson as a dedicated officer who made an honest mistake. An honest mistake? Natalie stood up, her voice rising with controlled passion. Was it an honest mistake when he refused to check my ID? When he mocked me in the station? When he treated me like a criminal despite all evidence to the contrary? She walked to her window, looking out at the city below. No, this wasn't a mistake. This was prejudice, pure and simple. And it's time we called it what it is. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Natalie appeared on local news programs, sharing her story and encouraging others to come forward. She met with civil rights organizations, community leaders, and other legal professionals who had faced similar discrimination. The pressure mounted on the police department. Internal Affairs couldn't ignore the growing evidence of systematic bias. Officer Jackson's personnel file revealed previous complaints of racial profiling, all of which had been quietly dismissed or buried in bureaucracy. A week after her arrest, the announcement came. Officer Jackson was suspended pending a full investigation. But for Natalie, this was just the beginning. They think suspending one officer will make this go away, she told a gathered crowd at a community forum. They think we'll be satisfied with empty gestures and hollow promises. But we're not going anywhere. This isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about changing a system that has failed us for far too long. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy feeding her determination. Among them were faces she recognized from the emails and messages she'd received other victims of racial profiling who had found the courage to speak up. Later that evening, as she prepared to leave her office, Natalie received an unexpected visitor. It was Lieutenant Martinez, the officer who had helped expose Jackson's misconduct. I wanted you to know, Martinez said, closing the door behind her. Your case has opened a lot of eyes in the department. Officers are talking, questioning their own biases. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Natalie nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing it wasn't enough. Change is always uncomfortable, Lieutenant, but discomfort is better than injustice. As Martinez left, Natalie turned back to her computer, where dozens more messages awaited her response. Each one represented a voice that had been silenced, a dignity that had been violated, a justice that had been denied. The suspension of Officer Jackson wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger fight. Natalie Brooks, the prosecutor who had been wrongly arrested, had become a symbol of resistance against systemic racism, and she was ready to use that platform to create lasting change. Her phone buzzed again, another interview request, another opportunity to share her story and amplify the voices of others who had been silenced for too long. Natalie smiled, her determination stronger than ever. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, real change felt possible. 3 months after her wrongful arrest, Natalie Brooks stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber, facing the newly formed Police Reform Committee. The room was packed with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and citizens who had come to witness what many were calling a watershed moment in the city's history. Change, Natalie began, her voice clear and strong, doesn't come from comfortable conversations. It comes from confronting uncomfortable truths. 3 months ago, I was humiliated and arrested for the crime of being black while looking for my purse in my own car. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as an agent of change. The committee members leaned forward, their attention fixed on her words. Among them sat Lieutenant Martinez, who had become an unexpected ally in the push for reform. In the audience, Ethan watched proudly as his colleague and friend continued to fight for justice. Since my arrest, over 500 individuals have come forward with similar stories of racial profiling in our city. Natalie continued, gesturing to the thick binder of testimonies before her. These aren't just statistics. They're mothers, fathers, doctors, teachers, students. They're your neighbors, your colleagues, your fellow citizens who have been judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. The reforms she was proposing were comprehensive. Mandatory body cameras with strict compliance measures, implicit bias training led by community members, an independent civilian oversight board, and a complete overhaul of the department's disciplinary procedures. Officer Jackson's suspension was necessary, she acknowledged, but it's not sufficient. We need systemic change, not symbolic gestures. We need to address the root causes of racial bias in law enforcement, not just its symptoms. As she spoke, Natalie couldn't help but remember the feeling of those handcuffs around her wrists, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. But now, that memory fueled her determination rather than her anger. The committee meetings became weekly occurrences, each session bringing new challenges and opportunities for change. Natalie worked tirelessly, building bridges between law enforcement and the community, facilitating difficult conversations about race and privilege. One particularly memorable evening, she organized a town hall meeting where citizens could share their experiences directly with police officers. The tension in the room was palpable as people stood up, one by one, to tell their stories. An elderly black man described being stopped while walking in his own neighborhood. A young mother tearfully recounted how her teenage son was handcuffed while playing in a park. A successful businessman shared how he was pulled over 3 times in 1 week, each time for routine checks. But something unexpected happened during these sessions. As the stories continued, she noticed a shift in the officers' expressions. Some who had initially seemed defensive began to listen with genuine concern. Others shared their own struggles with institutional pressures and unconscious biases. "We're not here to demonize law enforcement," Natalie would often say. "We're here to make it better, to ensure that it truly serves and protects everyone equally." 6 months after her arrest, the first wave of reforms was implemented. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for noncompliance. The Civilian Oversight Board was established, giving the community a real voice in police accountability. Training programs were revamped, with a new emphasis on de-escalation and cultural competency. But perhaps the most significant change was less tangible. There was a new willingness to acknowledge and address racial bias, both within the police department and the broader community. The uncomfortable conversations that Natalie had pushed for were finally happening. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after her arrest, Natalie stood in that same courthouse parking lot where her ordeal had begun. She was there to announce the latest initiative, a partnership between the DA's office and local community organizations to provide legal support for victims of racial profiling. A year ago, I stood in this spot, searching for my purse, she told the gathered crowd. What I found instead was a calling, a responsibility to ensure that no one else would have to experience what I did. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Black, white, brown, uniformed officers and civilian activists, all united in the pursuit of justice. This work isn't finished, she continued. Real change takes time, commitment, and courage. But look how far we've come. Look at what we can achieve when we confront injustice head-on, when we refuse to accept discrimination as inevitable, when we demand better from our institutions and ourselves. As she concluded her speech, Natalie caught sight of a young black girl in the audience, watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. In that moment, she knew that every struggle, every difficult conversation, every small victory had been worth it. The story of Natalie Brooks, the prosecutor who was wrongly arrested, had become more than just a cautionary tale about racial profiling. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that justice isn't just an ideal to be pursued in courtrooms, but a reality that must be fought for in every aspect of society. And as she stepped down from the podium, surrounded by supporters and fellow advocates for change, Natalie knew that while her personal ordeal had ended, the larger fight for equality and justice was just beginning. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone. She had sparked a movement, ignited a conversation, and set in motion changes that would ripple through their community for years to come. The work wasn't over, but the path forward was clear. One step at a time, one reform at a time, one mind at a time, they would build a justice system that truly served everyone equally, regardless of the color of their skin.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.